Welcome to the MamasteFit Podcast. Today's episode is going to be my first birth story, the birth of my daughter, Adeline. Welcome to the MamasteFit Podcast. This is Gina, perinatal fitness trainer and birth doula.
And this is Roxanne, labor and delivery nurse and student midwife.
And this is the MamasteFit Podcast, where we empower you on your prenatal fitness, birth, and postpartum return to fitness journey.
Our podcast shares how to move throughout your pregnancy to stay strong and comfortable. Pain is not a requirement of pregnancy. Understand the science of birth and how to approach recovery after birth.
We share our personal experiences as mothers navigating the stage of lives, plus our professional expertise as birth workers and fitness professionals.
Our goal is to help you feel confident as you navigate the perinatal timeframe for an empowering pregnancy, positive birth, and postpartum journey.
We are glad to have you with us on this journey and that you've chosen us to support you. Adeline was born in a hospital after a augmented labor, so I did go into spontaneous labor and then had it augmented with Pitocin, and I did end up getting an epidural. Today's episode is going to share some of my birth trauma from my very first birth, so if you do find that triggering for you, just proceed with caution. But this story is going to help you better understand how MamasteFit was formed and why we approach the things that we do. Getting pregnant with Adeline was pretty easy. We only started trying for a few months, and I think the third month we finally got pregnant. My period was late, but I still wasn't getting positive pregnancy tests, so I went to my provider and asked for a blood test to confirm pregnancy or to see what was going on, and they called me back to say that I was pregnant, but my HCG levels were super low, and so they wanted me to come back to do follow-up blood work because they wanted to know if I was going to have a miscarriage, and so me and my husband were like super worried that we were going to experience our first miscarriage, but fortunately the HCG levels were all doubling, and so we realized that I was probably just later in my cycle, and that's why the levels were so low. So at my first appointment at what I thought was 10 or 11 weeks, they did an ultrasound because I said I'm not sure when my last period was. My period was a little bit irregular. And they did this first trimester ultrasound to help determine my due date, and they found that I was actually only 8 weeks pregnant, which was destroying for me because I was super nauseous and sick during this first trimester, and I thought I was almost at the end of my first trimester for that sweet relief, and then realized I actually had 2 more weeks to go. But it was really great that I had gotten this first trimester ultrasound to help date my pregnancy, and you'll hear more about why that was so important for me at the end of my pregnancy. Let's take a break from this week's episode to hear from one of our sponsors, Needed, a nutrition company focused on optimal nourishment for the perinatal journey. We need choline to support our baby's neural tube formation and cognitive development, as well as for our own health benefits. But many of us are not getting enough choline in our diets, and most prenatals include only a bare minimum amount or none at all. New research also suggests that we need double of the current recommendations. That's one of the reasons I love Needed so much. Needed's core products contain choline, plus they have a choline add-on. I highly recommend adding Needed's choline onto any prenatal vitamin you are taking. To get started, head to thisisneeded.com and use code MamastePod for 20% off your first order or first 3 months of a Needed subscription.
So first trimester ultrasounds are best done between weeks 7 to 8 gestation, but it could be done anytime during that first trimester. And this is effective at dating babies' due dates because most babies, I say most because there's always those outliers, but most babies are the same size throughout the first trimester of pregnancy. So they're able to accurately tell you, 7-week baby will measure this big from the top of their head to their butt. An 8-week baby will measure this big, and they can almost say your baby is measuring 8 weeks and 3 days based off of this crown to rump measurement, which is from the top of the head to the butt. They'll usually do 3 different measurements in different angles to make sure that they get a very accurate sizing, and then they average out whatever the gestation that it finds based off of the 3 averages of the sizes. And then this is beneficial because a lot of people, they were finding, one, didn't even know when their last menstrual period was. I think around 40% of people either were wrong about their last menstrual period or didn't know their last menstrual period. So by having this kind of gold standard created where everyone gets this first trimester ultrasound, or it's offered to everybody, they have an idea of everyone's gestational age, and then they know a more accurate due date or guess date, depending on the word you use, to be able to determine if people are going past their due dates or if they still have time to have their babies.
So this was really important because my due date actually changed to be 10 days later, which was important because at the end of my pregnancy, when I hit my due date, my provider scheduled an induction for me 10 days past my due date, which I had kept my original due date and hadn't had that first trimester ultrasound. I would have gotten induced on my due date. So throughout my pregnancy, I was separated from my husband. Like, we were married and still happily married, but we were physically separated from one another due to the Army. And we were trying to get stationed back together, but our jobs like would not station us together. And so this is what kind of prompted me to actually get out of the military. Towards the end of my pregnancy, I transferred my care to the hospital at where my husband was stationed because I was just going to take leave to be there so that we can be at the birth like physically together. And then I was going to take my maternity leave in the home that we had where he was stationed. So the end of my pregnancy, I was super anxious about potentially going into labor like early, so before the 36 weeks when we would be reunited, and trying to figure out like how I was going to get to the hospital by myself and then how I was going to get him to where I was. And so that was like a big fear of mine towards the end of my pregnancy. But fortunately, I stayed pregnant for a really long time, so this ended up not being a real concern at the end. So my 36 weeks came and we decided to take some birth classes like right around this time frame. So I think I was like 32-ish weeks when we started taking childbirth ed classes, and I started to realize that I actually had more options than I thought I would even want for birth. I just thought I would just show up and whatever the doctor says that I would do, like why would I not get an epidural? Like I had always been like really afraid of childbirth, and I think probably throughout my life I had been told that it was super painful and that it was like the worst pain that you could ever experience. And so I had like a lot of fear even as a young child about childbirth. I decided, like, you know what, like, I feel like I should learn a little bit more about what my options are during my birth. And so we took a childbirth ed class. And so the class was great in the aspect that it helped me understand that I did, in fact, have options and that there were other ways that you can give birth, and that giving birth unmedicated or without an epidural could be incredibly empowering. And there was a reason to do it without medication. But it didn't do a good job in presenting the information to me unbiased. And so I left the course feeling like interventions were bad and they were evil, and if you get one, it's going to ruin your experience, and hospitals are just out to get you and to make money off of you, and the only place to give birth would be at home or a freestanding birth center. So we actually had even considered switching from a hospital to do a home birth, but we had no idea even how to go about it. It wouldn't have been covered by our insurance, and so we would have had to pay out of pocket for it. And then now that I have more experience in understanding how to find a home birth midwife, it actually probably would have been really difficult to even find a provider to support us at home. So ultimately, it wasn't an option for me at the time. My only option was to give birth in a hospital. And so I had a lot of anxiety about giving birth in the hospital and having what I would kind of considered at the time like my dream birth of this like unmedicated hospital birth. I found myself getting like really anxious about that. And so I got to my due date, and the nurse practitioner that was my provider for that appointment was just like, all right, 10 days from now, this is your scheduled induction. And I was kind of taken aback because I was expecting to have an opportunity to like have a conversation and to be like active in my care and to be an active like decision maker in this process. And I felt like she was just telling me what she was going to do to me. And that didn't really sit well for me. And I think I even got a cervical exam at that appointment, and it was pretty painful, and like the whole experience was just pretty negative. And this just kind of reinforced my fear of giving birth at that hospital or just in a hospital in general. And so I spent the next 10 days being super anxious and like really wanting to go into labor spontaneously. And I just was like really afraid of induction, and particularly of Pitocin. And I felt like Pitocin was going to ruin my dream birth. And everyone that I had kind of mentioned it to was like, it's not that bad. Like, and was just super dismissive of how I was feeling, to include Roxanne, who was like, it's not a big deal. Like, stop worrying about it. And so I felt like pretty unheard. And my husband would like listen to me, and like he was also like super scared about the hospital birth as well because of the class. And so we both were just like super anxious about what was going to happen to us. So 10 days passed and I was definitely still pregnant. I woke up one morning and it was like the day before my induction, just feeling like super defeated, but I had contractions and I knew what they were. I was like, oh, these are like labor contractions. This is different than like the Braxton Hicks that I've been feeling. Like this is something, but I did not want it to stop because then my induction was the next day. And so I was afraid if I was still pregnant the next day that I would be induced. And so I called Roxanne at like 5 a.m. and I was like, Roxanne, labor's happening. I called my doula who I had hired because Roxanne was at that point stationed in Tennessee and was like kind of in a transitional process of coming to North Carolina to be stationed there. So she was moving to North Carolina, but we weren't sure when she would be here compared to my baby's birth. And so if I went early, she would not be here. But if I went late, then she would be here. And so we hired a doula at my husband's recommendation based on all of his friends at work saying that doulas were amazing, which I was actually like shocked by because I didn't even really know what a doula was myself. So we hired a doula like thinking there's a good chance that Roxanne won't be there. And it's important for us to have somebody who's familiar to support us.
Gina was also pretty convinced that she was going to have her baby at 35, 36 weeks during her entire pregnancy. And I trusted her intuition on this. And I was like, if you think you're going to go early, then you should definitely have a doula because I will not be there because I will still be working in Tennessee.
Also, if I gave birth at 35 or 36 weeks, I would have been by myself in Georgia. So there was definitely a lot of anxiety about how I was going to manage the end of my pregnancy. And so we hired a doula. So I was having contractions. I called Roxanne and my doula to let them know that I was having contractions. What I should have done was probably rest, but because I was feeling very anxious, I think I walked like 3 miles. I was like cleaning my house and I just really wanted things to progress and I wanted them to progress quickly because I did not want to be pregnant the next day and then get induced. So Roxanne was telling me to rest. My contractions hit like 4 to 5 minutes apart. And this was probably about like 6 or 7 hours after they first began. And I told her I was going to go to the hospital because I was no longer like walking and talking through the contractions, even though I was completely coherent in between, which is a really big sign that somebody is probably in early active labor. So there are different phases to labor. We have our early labor, which is you are usually completely fine. You're unfazed by having contractions, but you're knowing you're having them and you're likely really excited. So during and in between contractions, totally unfazed. You can talk and walk through them, no problem. Then we get to an early active labor phase, which is still technically early labor, but you're starting to need a little bit of support during your contractions. The key here is that even though you're needing support during contractions and you can't walk and talk through them, in between you return to the space. So you're still mentally present in between contractions. So you'll be having a conversation, you'll stop to do your contraction and to focus on it, and then you return to the conversation. So this is a really big clue that you are on your way to active labor, but you're not quite there. So you might be anywhere from like 1 to 3 to 4 centimeters at this point. And dilation is just a moment in time, so it doesn't always correlate to like where you are in labor. But usually if you're still like pretty coherent in between contractions, we're still in an early labor pattern. When you make it to an active labor pattern, you're what I would call sleepy drunk. So you're no longer mentally present in the space. Like you're physically there, but you're mentally in your own little world. So during contractions, you need support. You're completely focusing on them. And then in between, you're just like not there. And so sometimes how we'll describe it in our childbirth education classes is you're sleepy drunk. So you can be brought back into the space to answer questions, but you're just kind of in your own little world and you're very like daisy or hazy with it all. So I was still in this early active labor point, but I did not want to believe that I was. I wanted to believe that I was just really good at labor and that it was just easy for me. And so I told Roxanne that I was going to go to the hospital, and against her advice, me and my husband jumped in the car and we drove to the hospital.
It's important to know Gina was in labor for like 4 hours at this point. So from first contraction to this point, 4 hours have passed.
It was more like 6, but it's not very much time at all. Also, my temperament was not telling her that I was in active labor yet. But my thing was like I was nervous about the car ride. We had about a 40-minute car drive, and I didn't want to be in active labor in that. So I was hoping that I was timing it well. I was not. Even my doula told me not to go, but I told them both that I knew my body and that I was progressing so fast. Spoiler, I did not progress that fast. So we get to the hospital and I was a whopping like 2 centimeters and they sent me home. And so instead of going home, I was like, I'm going to progress so fast. So I don't want to drive all the way home just to turn back around. So we're going to go walk at the track. And so we walk around the track for like an hour. My contractions are definitely picking up. We go to get dinner. And then at this point, it's probably like 6 or 7 p.m. So I've been laboring for about 12 to 13 hours. And I'm having like a really hard time in the car. And I'm like, things have definitely changed. Like I need to go back. I need to go back to the hospital. So we go back and I am 2 centimeters still. At this point, my doula had joined us at the hospital because she had just come from another birth and came directly to us. That other mom had her baby much faster than I did, and I was a little salty about it because I started laboring first. Labor and delivery at this point decided that they were going to admit me. And I didn't totally understand why they were going to admit me because I was still 2 centimeters. And even to this day, I don't totally know why I was admitted. Maybe it was because I was in induction the next day and they figured they would just take me. But because the floor was full, they sent me walking for about like 2 to 3 hours. So my mom is here, my sister's here, my doula's there. Obviously my husband and I are like there and we're just kind of, I'm in a labor gown. I'm like throwing up with my contractions now and we're just kind of walking around the hospital. And eventually we kind of settle in like the chapel that was on the same floor as labor and delivery. And I take like a mini nap in there and then we eventually get admitted to our labor room. Before this, when I was in triage, the midwife said, hey, when we get admitted, we'll start Pitocin. And I didn't totally understand why we were starting Pitocin because at this point I was having contractions and I was like, why would I need Pitocin if I'm having contractions? And so I think, and I haven't confirmed this, is because they just were like, well, you're in induction and we'll just continue with your induction at this point. So I felt really anxious about Pitocin. All I had heard at this point was how horrible it was and how strong it makes your contractions and it's unbearable. And so I was like, okay, I want to go unmedicated. I don't want to get an epidural. Like, what can I have to help me with these Pitocin contractions? And she was like, you can get IV pain meds. And I was like, okay, I don't really know what to do. So at this point, it was just my husband and I and the doula in our triage like tent, and Roxanne and my mom were out in the waiting area. And so Roxanne was not aware of all this stuff that was happening. When we did make it to our room, they got the Pitocin and they were going to hook it up. I was trying to talk to the midwife to ask about it. Like, do I still need it? Like, I feel like I'm contracting. And so she came in with like her arms crossed and was like, I heard you wanted to talk to me. And I was like, I do not want to talk to you. Like your body posture or your body language is telling me that you are not interested in talking to me either. And I feel very unsafe with you. So I said, I'm good. I have nothing to talk to you about. And they started the Pitocin. I was still very anxious about the Pitocin, so I was like, well, I would like some IV pain meds to help with these Pitocin contractions. What I know now is that Pitocin is a tool that is available to us to help augment or start our labor should we need it. It's not evil or bad. Like, there are times that we can use it and where it makes sense, and maybe some times where we don't need to use it. Pitocin also is slowly administered, so it's not 0 to 100 and like as soon as I turn the pump on. It does build over time. Pitocin contractions can feel more intense because Pitocin doesn't cross our blood-brain barrier. And so oxytocin is the contraction that helps stimulate uterine contractions or to help with our contractions, and it's released from a pituitary gland. It's kind of a pain reliever. So it causes those uterine contractions, but it's also our love hormone, so it makes you feel good about these contractions. It kind of takes the edge off of them for you. But with Pitocin, because it doesn't cross that blood-brain barrier, your perception of the contractions is unchanged, and so they can appear more intense. They can feel more intense than our normal occurring contractions would be. The other thing is that oxytocin can kind of ebb and flow, and so it can decrease in level as like we need more rest, for example, and kind of slow the labor down so we can get some more rest, or it can increase as labor is progressing. So it kind of will titrate itself as labor is going based on our individual needs and our baby's needs, while Pitocin is just a continual kind of pump, and so it doesn't change level as your personal needs are. And so those are kind of the differences between oxytocin and Pitocin. Pitocin is a tool that we can use to help augment labors that need it, but it's not always the answer. And so my biggest concern with Pitocin at that time, before I learned all of this information, was that it was going to make contractions super intense right away. And I was already having more trouble with the contractions. Like, I was already having a harder time with them, and I couldn't imagine what it would be like if it was even worse than this. So they administered me IV pain meds, which I ended up not loving. It sort of left me feeling like I was really drugged or drunk. I couldn't get out of the bed, so I was still feeling contractions, and it just felt like I was trapped in this bed. I did end up getting to fall asleep, but when I woke up, the Pitocin was still on, and the IV pain meds had run out, and I was wondering when they were going to turn my Pitocin off.
So with IV pain relief, it does not take away all the pain of your contractions. It just is supposed to make it a little bit more tolerable. So it's like the peak of the contraction is supposed to be less. So some people think that they'll get that IV pain relief and then they'll just be able to sleep. But depending on where you are in labor, that may not be the case. It may just make it a little bit more tolerable. And then there are different ways that they can give IV pain relief that is supposed to accentuate the effects to make it more likely that you will be able to rest. So Gina was supposed to get 2 different types of medications that work together to amplify the effects so that she would have been able to have like a really solid nap since she was still a little bit in that early active labor. But they gave it to her where she got 1 point, and then like an hour and a half later when one was starting to wear off, they gave her the second one. So she never got that full relief of that IV pain relief so that she was able to get like a full mini snooze. She did kick me in the head because I was sleeping at the end of her bed with my head on her by her feet to like provide her just emotional support. Nice sister trying to support her. And she kicked me in the head and goes, "When are they going to turn this Pitocin off?" And I said, "They don't turn it off unless you're in labor, but like they won't turn it off most of the time." And she just looks at me and she goes, "That's BS." And then laid her head back down and closed her eyes. And I was like, is it safe to go back to sleep? I don't think so.
So we got admitted to the room probably about like 2 a.m. So at that point, that would be like, 21 hours of being in labor from first contraction. By the time I woke up from my little IV pain med nap, it might have been like 4 a.m. So from the time we got settled into the room to where I woke up from this mini snooze, it was about 4 a.m. So everyone at this point has been awake for about 24 hours. My doula was like curled up in a corner. My husband and my mom were on the couch that was in there, and Roxanne was laying at the end of my bed. So when I did finally like wake up and realize that they were not in fact going to turn off the Pitocin, I called the nurse in and I was like, "Hello, I am awake now. My contractions are strong. I would like to turn this off." And she kind of laughed at me and said, "I will go get the midwife," who then came in still as angry as before and said, "No, we will not be turning this off." And this is when the full spiral of despair began for Gina. So I was already feeling very tense about my birth, like mentally very unstable at this point. The midwife's experience had definitely not helped me feeling very safe and supported in this environment. And then being told that I was still going to have these really strong Pitocin contractions destroyed my soul. So I started screaming at this point, saying that I did not want to do this anymore and that I would like an epidural. Being that my plan was to have an unmedicated birth, my team tried to help me. I probably flailed around the room for about another 2 hours before I finally convinced everybody that I would like to get an epidural. And they sat me on the toilet to where there's actually a photo of me sitting very angrily on the toilet, and then everyone really tried. I really appreciated the effort that everyone put in to try to calm me down. But I had just spiraled too much to where it was really hard for me to come back. And I also felt very unsupported by this provider. Had I waited maybe another hour when a new midwife came on, I might have had a different experience.
Gina also had 4 people kind of like encouraging her, maybe in an aggressive manner, more aggressive than she maybe needed, of like, "Hey, let's get up and go to the bathroom." I think that would be really beneficial. We were trying to be helpful, and then our mom is just like, "No, you're doing so great. You don't need the epidural." When really Gina probably just needed like her and Baron in the room to like calm down and like collect herself after her spiral. But 4 people probably kind of in a way, in her sense, was yelling at her to do something when you are already asking for something else. It does not help calm someone from their spiral.
So at this point, it was probably like 6:30, I would say like 7:30. I think shift change had happened when I was getting my epidural. So everyone has to leave the room when I got the epidural at the hospital that I was in. Some hospitals do allow like your partner to stay in the room, but they do try to limit the number of people because it is like a sterile environment where they do the epidural. And as soon as everyone left the room, I just felt this like wave of relief where I was like, oh man, maybe that's all I needed was for like there to just be less people in here like yelling at me at the same time. I guess they were probably talking to me, but I was just like, there was too much like happening. And I almost was like, oh, maybe I'll just labor by myself. Like, I don't need the epidural. But I was like, well, they're already in here. I guess I'll get it. And so I got it. And then I went to sleep and I took like a really nice nap, which was probably what I needed at that point. I was not in the mental space to continue to have an unmedicated birth without fighting it the whole time, based on the support that I was having with the hospital staff. So it was probably like 7:30-ish when I got the epidural. And I think maybe like 9, I was like 9.5, like almost 10 centimeters, but I had like a bulging bag of water. So what that means is my amniotic fluid sac was still intact. So my water had not broken. And part of the bag was starting to push through my cervix. And so it was like fluid sac kind of pushed through my cervix, the cervix, and then baby's head kind of hanging out there. And so the midwife came in and she was like, and this was a new midwife at this point, and she was like, hey, like you're pretty much 10 centimeters. If we break your bag of water, like you'll become 10 centimeters and we can start pushing. And I remember in that moment, and this is something that I'll see sometimes in my clients, and it like usually just like completely breaks my heart. In that moment, I just felt so defeated where, you know, everything that I had planned for and prepared for, it wasn't happening. And this is what I was getting. I was just like, sure, whatever, break my water, it's fine. I think at that point I even said like, is my baby in a good position? Like, I don't know. And then she was like, yeah, she's in a great position. So she broke my water and I just kind of like laid there until they told me it was time to push. And I thought, okay, I'm going to push for like 10 minutes and I'm going to see my baby. I pushed for 2.5 hours. Oh my God. I was not expecting to push for that long. Now that I know so much more about like better pushing techniques, I maybe would have only pushed for like 2 hours and 15 minutes. It is always really funny when people email or message us after they've been following our content or they took our courses or did our pushing webinar and they're like, for my first baby, I pushed for like 3 hours, but then I took your course and I pushed for like 15 minutes. And like, I want to take the credit, but really second time babies just usually fly out a little bit easier. But doing better techniques can make it a little bit easier of a process and could decrease your risk of tearing. So while I was pushing for the felt like forever time, there was like more and more people like entering the room. And I actually don't know who all these people were. For any of you that are birth workers, especially like hospital staff, and you've never met a patient before, it can be really helpful to introduce yourself because I was butt-ass naked. And I've just got these random people like coming in and witnessing me in a very vulnerable position. And it would have been very nice if they're like, hello, I see your vagina. My name is so-and-so. This is why I'm here. Or just respect the fact that I know we're in a hospital setting and there's very clinical things happening, but like this is still my body and my body is not a learning tool without my permission. And so at one point I looked at my nurse and I said, this was a totally new nurse. She was wonderful. Who are all these people? And she was like, oh, well, let me point them all out. This is your midwife. This is who I am. She had introduced herself before this, but she was just reinforcing, this is your baby nurse. This is a lady who's collecting cord blood. That is the attending doctor. That's a random resident. Those two people, I don't know why they're in here. Over there is NICU, because at this point I had been pushing for a long time. I think Adeline's heart rate was getting really low while I was pushing, which later we found out is because she had her hand by her face, so she was not in a wonderful position when I started pushing, and it was probably why it was taking so long. So just a lot of people in the room. My husband described it as feeling like he was watching a fight in high school, but you couldn't quite see because he had almost gotten like pushed away from the bed. So the attending doctor started talking about a vacuum, and at this point I did not know what a vacuum was. I was thinking like the Dyson vacuum that you use to clean your house and just thought it was gonna like suck my baby out of me. But I didn't know what it was, and I could just hear him whispering not quietly about it. So that's something else for folks that are providing medical care is if you're going to talk about different options, like talk about it to the patient. And if you're going to discuss it amongst yourselves, do that in a different room because we can hear you. We can hear you. So every time I pushed, I would lock eyes with him to make sure that he didn't pull something out without asking me because I was under the impression that he was not going to ask for my consent before he did something to my body. The midwife, I think, could really tell that he was going to start pushing interventions on me, and she looked at me and was like, hey, you know, I really think if I cut an episiotomy that your baby's going to come out, because she had been like crowning for like a really long time, it felt like. So I said, okay. And so they put the mirror away, which I really appreciated because the mirror was really helping me push to see like what was an effective push. And they cut the episiotomy. I had an epidural, so I didn't feel it at all. And then like I think the next push, Adeline came out with her hand by her head. She was placed on my chest for like half a second, and as I kind of tried to grab her, they took her off my chest to take her to the warmer. And I think it was because she was having those decels, or her heart rate was dropping during pushing, that they wanted to assess her. But she came out screaming, so not 100% sure why they still took her. I think there was just too many chefs in the kitchen at this point where everybody wanted to be a part of this birth experience. It's almost like when someone throws something at you and you go to catch it, but you totally miss, like your toddler when you try to throw a ball at them. It was like that. Like I was trying to go and hug her, and she was gone by the time I got there. So they brought her over to the warmer and like, hey Dad, you want to come cut the cord? And I was like, how long is this umbilical cord that this dude is going to cut it on the other side of the room? What they really meant was trim the cord, because it was already cut at this point. So he came over, he trimmed the cord, and then she was brought back over to me. She had her hand by her face, so that was what was making it so hard for her to come out. Roxanne, what's it called when they have their hand by their face?
This would be a compound hand. So it's not just their fist is by their face, but it's like the fist almost comes out at the same time as the head does. So it's like they're crowning, and then there's a hand there as well. So sometimes it's a fist, sometimes it's just their face palm in themselves, but like their little tiny hand. Sometimes it is just their hand is by their face, and that wouldn't be considered like a true compound hand, because it means their head comes out and then their fist just is like on their face. But some providers will call both a compound hand.
So she had a really nice cone head and a black eye from her hand being by her face. I didn't notice the cone head until I was looking at pictures later on. So if your babies come out with these really cute cone heads, they're going to put a little hat on it. You won't notice it. They're so cute when they come out. And then you'll look at photos and be like, oh my God, that is a torpedo head baby.
Yes. You see your baby and you're like, this is the most adorable baby I've ever seen. They're amazing. And then you look back a month later and you're like, what did my baby look like? Was that really what they looked like when they came out of me? And I was so happy about it.
So she was like swollen from pushing for so long. I had been on I haven't actually been on fluids for that long at this point. So she was born just after, almost noon. So I had pushed for like 2.5 hours. So from the time that I was probably starting to spiral to when I started pushing in was like 10 centimeters, because I had also gotten checked right before the epidural, which is sometimes something that I'll recommend to my clients who are wanting to get an epidural when their plan was to not get an epidural or to have an unmedicated birth is, hey, like before you decide or finally decide to get one, would you like to get a cervical exam? Because maybe you're like 9 centimeters. So would knowing how dilated you are change your mind? For some of them, they're like, I don't care if I'm 10, I'm getting an epidural. And I'm like, cool, don't get a cervical exam then. And for some of them, they're like, oh, maybe I will. And then they find out they're like 8 centimeters and they're like, oh, I'll keep going then. So I had gotten a cervical exam before I got the epidural, and I was still 4 centimeters. So I had been laboring now for like 25 hours, and I had progressed to 4 centimeters. And I was like, oh my God, if I'm only at 4 after 24 hours, it's going to take me like 3 more days to make it to 10. The thing about cervical dilation is a moment in time. So you can be 1 centimeter and have your baby in 5 minutes. You can be 8 centimeters and have your baby in like 12 hours. And so it's not a predictor of when you'll go into labor or even how fast your labor will go. It's just this moment in time. But for me, being told that I was 4 centimeters after over 24 hours of being in labor was heartbreaking, and it really confirmed that I wanted to get an epidural. So I pretty much went from 4 centimeters to pushing and being 10 centimeters, I would say like an hour or 2. So it was pretty quick. And part of it might have been because once I got the epidural, I could finally rest and relax with my contractions, which allowed me to make a lot of change. And the other part could be is that Roxanne and I all tend to have a little bit faster of active labors. We have these really long early labors, and then our active labor is much faster. So part of me is like, well, if I had waited or if I had kept going, then maybe I would have had my baby much faster. But I also could have just continued to be in like a lot of pain and not been able to cope very well for just longer than I was. So sometimes that's a strategy that I'll use for my clients that are wanting to go unmedicated, is to get checked. But remember, dilation is just a moment in time. So after Adeline's birth, there was definitely a lot of disappointment for me in kind of how her labor had gone, like how the end of my pregnancy had gone, how the birth had gone. I didn't have this unmedicated magical birth that I had been hoping for. And I felt like really unsupported by the hospital staff and just really defeated by the experience. And so it was really hard to feel disappointed in what happened during my birth and also feel very joyous that my baby was was here. And so part of it was this like conflict of I can have simultaneous emotions that conflict with one another, and it doesn't take away from the love that I have for my baby. And so that was something that I struggled with for a while, was not being disappointed because I felt like it would mean that I was disappointed with my baby. You know, if I ever told her story, like, would she feel sad that that's how she came into the world? And so there was definitely a lot of healing and processing that had to happen after her birth. And my subsequent births definitely supported that healing process. Not that you should look at your next births as like your redemption by any means, because that's a lot to put on a baby. But there was definitely a lot of healing that happened after Adeline's birth, and generally just feeling very unheard and unsupported. Not necessarily by my chosen team, like I felt very supported by my doula and by my sister, my husband and my mom, but I felt really unsupported by the hospital staff at that time. And I've gone on to support births in that hospital, and Roxanne went on to have a birth in the hospital. They were all very positive experiences. So it's not to say like that hospital was evil or bad or anything. It was just somebody who was having a bad day. Later we came to find out that that midwife was actually going through a lot of stuff in her personal life with like her own children, and she probably shouldn't have been at work that day. But because of Adeline's birth, I was able to experience the hard side of labor. Like I didn't just have 3 magical births that I just expected everyone to have. I understood personally that birth doesn't always go the way that you were preparing for or that you were hoping for, and that it didn't mean that I deserved that experience or that I did anything wrong. And it didn't mean that I couldn't have a better experience in the future, even if it wasn't exactly what I was hoping for. And so that was something that really influenced how MamasteFit was created. Like when I created it because I felt very alone, and I wanted to create a community for other moms to be in, to come and share their stories and to be a part of something together, to have this village that we all hear about. But it also really influenced how we approached providing support with our birth education classes. And so the course that I had taken was great in teaching me about my options that I actually had no idea that I had, and that there was other ways to give birth other than do what exactly as your doctor says and to get an epidural and just kind of cross your fingers that everything goes great. Not that getting an epidural or really trusting your provider is wrong in any ways, but you have options. And if you don't know them, then you don't have any. And so that was something that was really beneficial about that course, was I understood that, oh, there actually are a lot of options out there. The thing that we wanted to improve upon was to share about your options and to teach more of kind of the science of what was happening so that you could understand what was happening in a way that was unbiased. So what I choose to do in my personal life with my births and with my children, and what Roxanne chooses to do with her personal life, her births and her children, it's okay if you choose something different. And Roxanne and I both choose different things even between the two of us, like supporting the MamasteFit platform. And so we wanted to share the options that could be available to you in various birth locations, particularly in a hospital setting where you tend to have more intervention available, in a way that was unbiased, because there's good reasons to get certain interventions at different times. Not everybody has a smooth, uncomplicated pregnancy, birth, and postpartum period. Some of us do have more complications that do require intervention. If you developed a serious prenatal complication at the end of your pregnancy where induction was the safer option, then we need that option available to us. Or if cesarean birth is the best option for you and your baby, we need to have that option available to us and not put morality on the interventions that are available to you. And so it was important for us in our course to teach about these options in a way that was unbiased so that you understood what the risk versus benefit is, and then help you understand the questions to ask to then make the best decision for you and your family, regardless of what we would choose. And you might notice in our courses, we don't usually talk about what we would do in this specific situation, because it could be different. We could be in the same exact scenario and you may choose something different. The other thing that I learned from my own birth experience, besides going through it personally, was because I felt so defeated by the experience, was I found it really important to hold space for my clients. So my doula clients and for my fitness clients that I work with in person, is that everyone kind of has their own story and their own stuff that they're going through, and being able to hold space for them to heal from the experiences that they had was really important. And to also validate what people are feeling. I was really scared of Pitocin, but nobody really took the time to explain to me that it was a tool that was available to us. You know, sometimes going too late in pregnancy could have complications. Like, these are some good questions to talk to about your provider. You don't have to go in just because you have an induction schedule. So instead of talking to me about what my options were and going over risk versus benefit with me, I felt like I was just really dismissed. And so I found that it was really important when someone was bringing up a concern to me, regardless of my initial reaction to it, it was important to hold space for them and to hear them and then help them develop like a course of action if that's what they want from me.
From Gina's birth, I definitely changed a lot of things for me, for not just like me as a labor nurse, but obviously just like me as a person. Being able to support a family member during a very vulnerable time is like, I was very lucky that we are so close that I got to be able to be there. It kind of worked out that Adeline waited for me to get there as well. So appreciate her waiting for me to be at the birth. I'm sorry for Gina having to stay pregnant for so long, but I was appreciative. But from being there, it gave me a different perspective other than just the labor nurse side. My first experience being a supporter of someone who was in labor rather than their nurse while they were in labor. And it was definitely very eye-opening because we felt so confused the entire time about what was going on. Like, I was under the impression that Gina was in labor when we arrived. So like she was making change and like wasn't being induced. So then when they were bringing up like, hey, we're going to start your Pitocin, then I just assumed, oh, Gina must have agreed to this because I know she really didn't want Pitocin. So like I didn't want to step on any toes, but like had I been like the labor nurse that was presenting all of these options, being able to explain to people like my patients why you're getting Pitocin, what is Pitocin doing? Like, what are we looking for when you're getting Pitocin? Like, it does, because we're starting this doesn't mean we're going to keep it on forever. Like, potentially we're hoping your body will go into labor and it'll shut off. But these are all things that I now educate all my patients on Pitocin and make sure that they understand, because from Gina's birth, she literally was so afraid of it and didn't understand it. And then also didn't really understand why she was getting it. Now I make sure that I do that because I don't want anyone else to be confused like we were during Gina's labor. And then during her entire like just labor process, I felt like I could have done a better job supporting her, being there for her. And I think that that's changed just like my perspective of birth. As a labor nurse, I was only a nurse for about 2 years for labor and delivery at this time. So I was still fairly new. 2 years is a long time, but it's still not enough to have, be like an expert at it. So I was still trying to figure out the best ways to be a labor nurse. And from her birth, I've definitely changed kind of how I approach supporting birth. Your voice is important during the entire labor process. It's not just like they come in and we check their cervix and they go into labor with all of these tools and we have all of these interventions that are going to help them. But in actuality, they might not need any of these interventions at all. Like sometimes just letting them do their thing is the best. And then different positions that in my mind and what I was taught actually is probably not the best position for pushing or when they're in different parts of labor. No one explains all of these things in nursing school down to the pelvic biomechanics and like what parts is opening the pelvis during labor. You don't learn this stuff in school. It's just kind of like on the job and like you seeking out this knowledge. So I've been very lucky that I've been able to, learn a lot about the pelvis from Gina, more so in like other courses that we have taken, like spinning babies and just like continuing educations that I've sought out for myself from the experience of Gina's first birth. So I feel very guilty in a way whenever Gina has to talk about her birth and she's sad in any way. I mean, I don't want that for anybody to like, for them to look back on their birth and feel sad or feel like they missed out or on something. No one goes into birth working, I hope, ruin people's birth stories and birth experiences. I want everyone to feel that they were heard, an active participant in their birth, and that it was like somewhat of an empowering moment. Because I mean, you literally you grew this human or humans. There could be multiples. You grew a human in your own body, and that is amazing. And then you brought them into this world using your body. So like for you to feel sad about the way that happened breaks my heart as a birth worker. And then like this MamasteFit platform really brought this passion of like empowering people to seek out the knowledge and like give people the knowledge so that they can have this great birth. Even if it doesn't turn out exactly the way that you hope, like you wanted this unmedicated intervention-free birth, but maybe you needed some interventions along the way, but you understood what interventions were available to you and you almost, in a way, chose them for yourself because you are the person who's running the show. Had Gina been given the choice and been able to then choose Pitocin for herself, it could be a different story. If she chose to be like, yeah, do you think that maybe breaking my water would be a great intervention at this time? Because that's something that I've heard about. And then they explained what it was and then she chose it for herself. It could have been a different story rather than, hey, we're going to start Pitocin. Hey, we're going to break your water. I feel like I'm going on a tangent, but I feel like the way that we use our words that are very powerful and the way we present options to people could be different. This is something that I've learned just from MamasteFit and from Gina's birth, from people's stories, that this is a need, that there is a change that needs to happen, and we can be part of that change, even as just like two little people.
So I think for me, the most important thing that could have happened in my first birth, regardless if I had an epidural or if I didn't get an epidural, was being heard and to have felt supported by everyone that was in the room. So I obviously felt really supported by my chosen team. I did not feel very supported by the medical team that was there. And that really influenced my next two births and choosing my provider and how important that was to really shape my birth experiences. Even though I had like my next two births, like what I would have described as my dream birth, being heard and supported throughout my pregnancy and throughout my birth made a huge difference in how I felt about my experience, even when I had to choose things that maybe I didn't want. Had I had that with my first birth, this would have been a very positive birth story, even if all the same exact things happened. Because the experience that I had with my team after shift change, so my daytime midwife and nurse who were there when Adeline was actually born, was completely different than the shift that was on at night. And I think had they been the people that I started the shift with or started my hospital experience with, it would have been a completely different experience. And so I was glad that they were there at the actual delivery. I just wish that they're there the entire time. And I hope for everyone that's listening to this that you understand how important it is to know what your options are, to have conversations with your partner and with your team, both your medical and your personally chosen team, about your preferences for these different options and interventions, to understand what the pros and cons are of them and what you would decide in different scenarios, as opposed to only a yes or no sheet, because certain scenarios, it may be better to get a certain type of intervention. Does every scenario mean it? No, but understanding what your preferences are at each situation can be really helpful. And then it's so important to choose a provider that you truly trust to help you navigate those hard situations where you have to make a decision that maybe ventures off from your original plan. But you can't have that if you don't trust your provider to guide you through it. And that's which have made a huge difference for me to feel safe in the hospital environment that I was in. So thank you so much for listening to my first birth story and kind of how it really influenced the creation of MamasteFit. This story is always a little hard for me to tell, and I think it's hard for Roxanne to also reflect on. It felt like not a failure, but it felt like a lot of things could have been so different to have made an experience that I'm probably only going to have a few times in my life, to have made that a much more positive story to look back on. So we hope that everything that we're sharing with our Instagram page, with this podcast, and with our online courses help you to have a more empowering experience regardless of what happens. And that's the biggest goal of ours, and it always feels really great to hear stories from our followers on how they followed our page and wrote down a few things and they went on to have a really great experience, even if it ended in whatever, even if they had a C-section, even if they got an epidural, or hey, they had the unmedicated birth using our tips. And so that means a lot to us to know that we're helping people all over the world have that positive and empowering birth experience, regardless of what physically happens, because they felt heard, they felt supported, and they felt educated on their options and knew how to advocate for themselves. In next week's episode, we'll be discussing how we can use our prenatal fitness to not only stay strong throughout pregnancy, to support our comfort throughout pregnancy, but also prepare for birth. So we're going to be breaking down different exercises that you can do throughout your pregnancy to support opening the pelvis so that we can avoid labor stalls and then also have an easier labor. If you enjoyed this episode of the MamasteFit Podcast, make sure you subscribe, rate, and leave us a review, and we'll see you next week. The MamasteFit Podcast is sponsored by Needed, a nutrition company focused on optimal nourishment for your perinatal journey. Use code MamasteFitPod for 20% off your first order.